They took me off a supply hauler 11 days out from the Varan relay, and I never saw the crew again. I was cargo hand, nothing more. I loaded crates and slept in a berth the size of a coffin, and sent half my pay home to a sister, raising 2 kids on a moon that barely had gravity to spare. That is the whole of what I was before Kethrun. I tell people that first, because what happened after makes no sense, unless you understand there was nothing special about me going in. Before Kethrun, I'd never heard of the Ith, and I'd have been happy to keep it that way. They came aboard the hauler in gray armor that didn't reflect light, moved through the cargo bay without raising their voices, and left with anything that could hold still and breathe. 12 of us went into the same transport crate. 9 of us came out the other end on Kethrun. Nobody explained the difference, and I stopped asking after the second day, because the ones who asked questions seemed to get moved to a different line than the rest of us, and none of them came back to that line either. The Ith call their arena the Carven. It is a bowl cut into red stone, 300 meters across, open to a sky the color of a bruise healing. They fill it with captives from a dozen systems, and they fill it with things bred in vats that were never meant to think, and they let the two collide while 40,000 of them scream from the terraces. I was told, by a handler who spoke my language like it was a chore, that I would fight in the 3rd rotation. I was told to be grateful they'd fed me first. The holding cell under the sand smelled like rust and old fear, the kind that soaks into stone over years and never quite leaves. I spent most of the night before my rotation listening to something in the next cell pace in a tight, even circle, 4 steps and turn, 4 steps and turn, and I didn't know yet that it was the same animal I'd be facing in the morning. I didn't sleep. I don't think it did either. The thing I fought was called a Senoth. I only learned the word later, from the one Ith who ever spoke to me like I had a name. It was built long and low, plated across the spine, with a jaw that could take an arm off at the shoulder without slowing down. It came into the pit already bleeding from the collar spikes they used to drive it forward, already screaming in a register that hurt behind my eyes. I had a spear. I had never held a spear before that morning. I want to say I fought well. I didn't. I fell twice in the first minute, and the second time I fell, I put my hand out to catch myself, and felt the Senoth's foreleg come down an inch from my fingers, close enough that I felt the wind of it. The crowd loved that. I could hear it change pitch, that hunger a crowd gets when it thinks the ending is close. What actually happened was smaller and stupider than anything the crowd wanted. I got the spear up on reflex, not skill, and the Senoth ran onto it going full speed, because it wasn't thinking either. It was driven, not hunting. The haft snapped. The head of the spear tore a long gash down its foreleg, deep enough that I saw the bone flash white for a second before the blood covered it. The animal went down hard, 3 legs, screaming different now, higher, and it dragged itself back from me across the sand instead of finishing what the collar spikes had started. I was supposed to close the distance and put the broken haft through its throat. That was the whole shape of the thing, the only ending 40,000 people had paid to see. I even started toward it, and then I looked at the wound. It wasn't hunting me. It never had been. It had been driven into that pit the same as I had, by different hands using different tools, and now it was bleeding out on red sand while a crowd screamed for the part where it finally stopped moving. I don't know how to explain what changed in that second, except to say that I stopped seeing an enemy and started seeing a wound. I tore the sleeve off my own shirt, the left one. I remember that specifically, because I remember how badly my hands were shaking trying to knot fabric one-handed, while keeping the other palm flat against torn muscle to slow the bleeding. I tied it above the gash, twisted it tight the way I'd learned tying off a burst line on the hauler, and I knelt there in the sand with my hand pressed against an animal that could have taken my arm off a second earlier, and I didn't move. The Carven went quiet. Not all at once. It rolled backward through the terraces like weather, 40,000 voices dropping out in waves, until the loudest sound left was the Senoth's breathing, ragged and slowing under my hand. I have never heard a silence like that before or since. It had weight. It pressed on the back of my neck. I did not look up at the box where the magistrate sat. I kept my eyes on the strip of cloth and the blood soaking through it, and I watched the animal's breathing even out, degree by degree, the way you watch a fever break in someone you're not sure is going to make it. At some point, it stopped trying to pull away from me. That was the only sign I needed that the tourniquet was holding. They didn't kill me for it. I've turned that over more times than I can count, and I still don't have a clean answer, only pieces. One piece is that the silence itself unsettled them worse than a death would have. 40,000 people don't like discovering, all at once, that they came for a killing and got something they don't have a word for. Another piece has a name, Ovrin Sai, the ith who ran the games that season, who I'm told left her box before the sand cruise even came out, who I met 3 days later in the cell block with no guards behind her, and a question she'd apparently walked a long way to ask. She wanted to know why. I told her the only honest answer I had, that the thing was screaming, and I had a strip of cloth in 2 hands, and killing it wouldn't have proven anything except that I could. She didn't say much back. She looked at the tourniquet mark still healing on my palm where the fabric had cut in, and then she looked at the door, like she was deciding something. What she decided took the shape of a writ. Eventually, my release, and the Sennoths, filed under a games regulation so old nobody had invoked it in 2th generations, something about creatures spared in the pit belonging to whoever spared them. She offered me passage home on the first transport out, and citizenship papers besides. An apology dressed up in official language for a system that had never once asked my name before it put a spear in my hand. I turned down the papers. I kept the passage home because my sister was still raising 2 kids on a moon with thin gravity, and I hadn't sent money in longer than I wanted to think about. But I didn't want to be owed anything by the Carven, and I didn't want the Sennoth handed off to some sanctuary program that would file it under livestock with better paperwork. I asked instead if it could walk onto the transport with me. Ovrin didn't ask why that time. I think she already knew. The Sennoth still limps on that leg. It sleeps in the cargo hold of whatever ship I'm working now, curled around the crates the way it once curled around nothing, because nothing had ever been safe enough to curl around before. It doesn't answer to a name, not really, though I gave it one anyway, quietly, the first night out from Kethrun, and I like to think it's learned the shape of the sound if not the meaning. People ask me sometimes what it felt like, kneeling there with my hand on an animal that had nearly taken my arm off, in front of 40,000 people who wanted it dead. I tell them it didn't feel like anything I could name at the time. It only felt like something, later. On the transport home, watching it sleep with its ruined leg tucked under it, breathing slow and even for the first time since either of us had arrived on that red sand, that was when I understood what I'd actually done. I hadn't won anything. I just refused to finish what somebody else started. It turned out that was the part nobody in that arena had a word for.